Alright, everybody, my name is Josh Rivera. I'm going to do an introduction for our good sir Pete. We'll keep it brief, very simple. Of course, most of you guys stayed in the room, I believe, already, or some of you guys are coming in. So welcome to BSides San Antonio. If this is your first time, I hope you come again next year. And we're going to go ahead and do a quick shout out to our diamond sponsors, USAA, and then St. Mary's as well. We're also grateful for our supporting platinum sponsors, which is Island. And also a couple more. We have the Toyota Susho Systems, that's the gold sponsor. And then silver sponsors, that would be Deloitte, Alamo Issa, and then Black Hills. The rest will be in technical equipment. And then today we're going to go ahead and turn over the stage to Pete, and we are going to be discussing identity and access management, IAM, and how it all fits together. Let's go ahead and move around the applause.
Thank you for joining me here today. We're going to do things a little different than some of the other talks we've heard today. I'm not going to talk about any products. I'm not going to talk about any solutions. I'm not going to talk about AI. But I am going to cover how you put together an IAM program at a high level, functional capabilities. So, what is the capabilities model? In essence, is what you say you do as an IAM program. It's what you are signing up for and what you're not signing up for by its very absence. So, what does it look like? It describes essential IAM functions. It's a tool to align processes and make sure you get everything that you need in your program, your risks, your technologies, your controls. It's critical to understanding where you are today in the maturity of your program, where you are and where you're going. So at a high level, this is tier one. And tier one, we're going to talk through. We're going to talk through the IAM program, which is how you frame all of this. You're going to talk through the data. Without good access and identity data, none of the rest of the stuff matters. You're going to talk access provision and deprovision, how you grant people the access safely, securely, the right way. We're going to talk access review, how you validate that they still have the access they need. You're going to talk authentication, which is how do we prove that you're you before we let you get access into our organization? Prove Bob is Bob. And we're going to talk about Bob a lot today. Authorization, we're going to talk about what should Bob have access to once he's proved he belongs and he has the access. Privileged access management is an odd beast to have up here. I've played around with it not in the capability model and within the capability model. The way I describe that is privileged access management is just you doing the other steps of your IAM program for privileged. But when you don't have it broken out, your auditors, regulators, etc., go, where's your privileged access management? You go, someone's in here, someone's in there. They get confused. And the one thing you're going to ever learn in this business is you don't want confused auditors. You want confident auditors who know that you know what you're doing, or at least believe you know what you're doing. So we gave it its own box. And then finally, IAM, analytics, and reporting. So we're going to say, how do you know you're doing all of things? So that's tier one. Tier two, this is an eye chart. Actually, when I was sitting back here a little bit earlier, I looked over there, and it kind of looks like a periodic table of IAM. And right now, I'd like to tell you that this is an eye chart. We're not going to drain this slide. Don't worry. But I'd be lying. We're going to drain the hell out of this slide. In fact, we're going to spend the entire talk talking about stuff that's up here on this slide. The whole, everything we get is right there. But I'm not going to have you read it in that format. So, capabilities diagram. We're going to walk through how all this fits together. And by the end, you're going to know how an IAM program should go together and why you're doing what you're doing. Because too often you sit there with a vendor, etc., and they say, you need buy our product. Well, why? Because we do this thing. Well, is that a thing you need to do? Are you not doing it well already? How do you know what you actually need? So I start up here in the top right. And we're gonna spend basically the entire presentation on one slide now. You're gonna see it. But we're just gonna start with laws and regs. And I don't see my lawyer in here. He was in a few of the previous stuff. Where is he? No, he was over there, but I didn't see him anymore. You need to make friends with your lawyer. If you have a lawyer, if your company has a lawyer, most big companies do. You need to know what laws and regs apply to you. You need to figure out, does PCI apply to me? Do I sell simple credit cards? Am I a publicly traded company? Do I need SOX? Do I have health information? Do I need HIPAA? Am I a financial institution? Do I need FFIEC? Insurance, I need NIST. You need to know. And even the ones that are just frameworks, recommendations. If you say you're a NIST shop, even if you're not a governmental agency, if you follow NIST, pretty much, you need to know what those are, because those are the start of what you're signing up to do. You can't break the law. Well, you can, but there are consequences to it. That feeds directly into policies and standards. So from there, you're basically saying, these are the things my organization is saying we're going to do. Now, those could be based off of laws and regs, best practices, could be that I feel like it, and I'm writing the standard, so I wrote it in there. That feeds the process of risk, but risks kind of feed back and forth. So your policies and standards will be written with your risks understood, but not following your policies and standards is a compliance risk if you're not following the laws and regs. So they feed off each other. But processes and controls are how you say you do something and what exactly you're providing to the enterprise when you say you have an IAM control, etc. Okay, we're gonna have little pop-ups when it gets interesting and we go a little more in depth, but the first one we're gonna have is on application onboarding. So we're gonna go through a whole bunch of stuff in your IAM program. You're gonna say you do. Well, do you do it for one application, two applications, all applications? Usually it's somewhere between one and all. But basically, you have to have a process, a formalized process that you audit and go through that says, am I doing these things for this application? It has to be assessed. It has to be assessed on a regular basis. If they are clipping into your IAM program, they inherit a whole bunch of capabilities and controls. If they don't get to not do them. They have to have a non-common control. And those are a pain in the butt. They have to basically figure out how are they doing what you're doing for the enterprise for their application. They're going to say, I can't do all that. And you're usually right. They can't. But if they don't clip into your organization, they have to. Or you at least have to accept that risk somewhere. You need an exception. You need something to declare that. So, okay, application onboarding. What are you onboarding? So, it depends. There's a culture shift. Some products call it a source. Other things call it a target. It doesn't really matter. I call it the targets up here. We have directories. Those are the things you think of like Active Directory, Entra, ID, Okta, etc., where you're collecting large amounts of identities, accounts, entitlements, etc. Target applications. Those could be any application. Application ABC, Box, Workday, etc. Databases, Oracle, Snowflake, etc. Those are often forgotten by the enterprises when it comes to IAM. They aren't thought of as much. And then finally systems, whether it's Unix, Windows, etc. But that's just a collection. There's more. But you've got to figure out how you're going to deal with that whole inventory of stuff that your enterprise relies on. Okay, so a little more into nomenclature. Identities. We're going to talk identities and accounts real quick, because there's a lot of vendors out there who get really confused between the two. The identity, when you're talking a user, a human, has a belly button, as we like to say. So Jonathan right here is an identity. But Jonathan might have multiple accounts in my enterprise. Account is what you're allowing the access to. A representation of Jonathan allowing into Workday, we're allowing into this Windows server, this database, etc. So the identity can have multiple accounts. The identity has things happen to them. They might get hired by the company, they might change jobs in the company, they might retire, they might hit the lottery and go away. We don't know, but the accounts are dependent on the identity. There's a relationship there is what I'm getting at. Okay, so we're up at the top left right now, and identity verification. We're gonna come back to this one a little bit later, but real quick, we're gonna touch on it. When you first start at a company, who's the first person usually verifies you? It's usually HR or corporate investigations. And they usually do like an I-9 check to prove that you have certain criteria. They might check your driver's license or passport. They might have corporate investigations, prove that Bob doesn't have a record, doesn't have a felony on his record. Went to the college Bob said he went to. Things like that. That's a form of identity verification. But we're going to come back to this one a little bit later. Okay, identity source of record. So somebody needs to have a record of all the employees, all the contractors, all the bots. It doesn't have to be one source of record, but you should have one per identity type, or not more than one per identity type, I should say. So a lot of you might have worked for a company that uses Workday, or they might use PeopleSoft, or they might use Fieldglass, etc. It doesn't matter what it is for the sake of this discussion, but you should know what it is. And they're going to keep a record of Bob is an employee, his address is this, his manager is that, he works in this unit, his job code is this, he's an active employee or he's retired, etc. You need this information. You cannot run your IAM program without it. But no IAM program typically has that information or is responsible for it. HR is. Great, so we've got to get it. And where do we need to bring it into? Something we do manage, identity data management. So we need to take that data in near real time, if possible. Sometimes you do batch jobs, but that you get delayed, bad things happen, etc. Usually not on a joiner, which we're going to talk more in a second, but when somebody starts a company, if it takes an extra 6 hours to tell you to start the company, might be annoying, but usually not the end of the world. If it takes an extra 6 hours for me to know that Jonathan was walked out the door by security, that might be a problem. So we need to know this data, we need to have it accurate, and we need a copy of it. Now we're going to talk through the identity lifecycle management. So joiner, it's pretty basic. Joiner is when somebody starts your company. There's an employee or a contractor, or even a third-party vendor coming in, etc. You need to know from your source of record when I should give them the access. Now, some of the access we're going to talk about more in a minute might be automatic, some might not, some has to be manual supervision, but I need to know when Bob has started the company. Likewise, I need to know when they move. When they move jobs in the company, what needs to happen? See, that's what's important with these capabilities. We're discussing not technologies, not functional products. We're talking what needs to happen. Well, when somebody switches jobs, we need to reevaluate their access. That's it in a nutshell. Now, your company might have a rule that says, you left the company, you changed jobs, we're going to strip off all your privilege access because we don't want to trust that. And if you need it, we'll add it back. We might say we're going to strip all your access if you change departments. Or maybe we're going to say if you change jobs at all. But it's important that you have a good definition of what a mover is. We all conceptually know what we're talking about. Job and change jobs. Okay, what does that mean? I've got certain attributes that I'm getting from HR. So if he changes unit codes, well, no, his department got too big, his under his manager got too big, so they split it off. Gave him he stayed under his manager or he moved to the country manager, and they gave him a different job in Unicode. Well, then you stripped his access. Maybe that's good, maybe that's not. You have to work with your HR department. That's the scary part, is your partners here. Your partners with your HR department. Sometimes they embrace that, other times they say, well, we don't want to be part of access. Well, they don't really get a choice in today's world. But mover is, of course, followed up by the leaver. Somebody leaves the company. That's an easy one as far as defining what we want to have happen. We want all access for Bob to be stripped when he leaves the company. How quickly? That's a good question. How thoroughly? How do you do it? If you have access that is manually provisioned versus automatically provisioned, deprovisioned, all that fun stuff. And finally, roles-based access. We're going to talk through authorization models, but roles-based access is a way or based off of some criteria. Now, the criteria can easily be just, we have a manual role. It's a bin that we can put people in. We put people in, it gives them these 5 entitlements. It can be that simple. Or it can be that Bob started the company, he's now an active employee in IT. Or in the sales department in Tucson, Arizona. You can make your roles fit that. But a specific kind of role is a birthright role. And those are those automated roles based off identity attributes like all IT employees. Okay, so if you're an IT employee, we're going to give you this access. You don't have to ask for it, and you can't even give it back if you don't need it. The role grants you that. So, okay, we got joiner, mover, leaver. We got that going to the roles because that's where birthright comes from. And now we get to access requests and approval. I know this is kind of like, okay, that's not very exciting, Pete. But this is where you're going to be burned on audits right away. If you don't go through your program and sit there and say, I can prove that Bob got this access on this date with this request by this approver, you've got a gap. You're going to have issues. So with the access request and approver, it's important for you to know who's allowed to approve certain access. And some companies make it so that the manager of the user requesting the access can approve access up to a certain level. Great. Other companies say, no, every entitlement, every bit of access has an owner. And that owner has to approve if that person gets it. Some only do that for privilege. So you have to figure out, going back to your requirements, what are your requirements? What does the law say? Etc. Okay, I keep mentioning the word entitlement. A lot of people use access interchangeably with entitlement, or a lot of times when you're talking about entitlement, most people are thinking active directory groups. That's a form of an entitlement. Entitlement is the bit of access that's attached to an account that lets you do something. Access talks about accounts, entitlements, et cetera, et cetera. But that's the specific permissions that let you do something. So you notice all 3 of those boxes converge on one, separation of duties. That one's usually one that's forced on you by certain laws and regs. Insurance is very big on that. Banking is very big on that. There's a lot. BCI, if you have your credit cards, is very big on that. Basically, you're saying this bit of access, this entitlement, and this entitlement, the same person should never have those. That's known as the toxic pair or toxic combination of entitlements. A common one in accounting is the person whose accounts receivable and accounts payable shouldn't be the same person because they could cash their own stuff. That's a typical thing. But you can think of a lot of different ones. In insurance, the person writing up the policy should not be able to cash in the policy. It's what they'll write up. You can think of a lot of different ones. Even on a U.S. missile base, there's 2 switches that both have to be thrown. One person can't throw both of them. Doesn't have both sets of keys. So separation of duties, the reason why it's placed there is the access request has to go through separation of duties. The roles have to go through separation opportunity. Whether you do that before or after the approver is up to you, but it has to be done. You can't be granting a toxic combination. Now, I drew in another of our data boxes, metadata management. We're going to use that for a few different things here. But the thing we need it for right now is the toxic combinations. So we're keeping the entitlements with metadata. Metadata is things like who owns the entitlement? What's the description of the entitlement? Is the entitlement privileged? Is it part of a toxic combination? Which toxic combination? What other entitlement? Things like that. So we'll come back to that. And then we're sending the entitlement to the access data manager. We're keeping track that this identity has this access, these accounts, these entitlements, etc. Now remember, we haven't actually granted any of the access yet. We're just recording what they've been authorized to do. Now, I just drew a box around those three because that's all your data. That's pretty much the data you need to start doing your program. We'll come back to that, but that's the identity, the access, and the metadata all in one. Okay, so now we're going to talk access provisioning. That's granting the access. If Bob needs access to administer application XYZ, you need to grant it to him. If he doesn't have an account on application XYZ, you need to grant the account and then the entitlement. If he already has the account, you just grant the entitlement. You have to be aware enough to do that. Access deprovisioning, we just do that backwards. We just want to take away. So he switched jobs, he doesn't need it anymore, he left the company. For whatever reason, we want to take away access from Bob. This is how we do it. And the third part, access reconciliation, sometimes referred to as aggregation. This is where you're querying the system that you're adding and removing the access from, going, okay, we've done a lot of these lately. We've added and removed millions of stuff. Let's bounce our checkbook, which is really what you're doing. You're asking that system, what accounts and what entitlements do you think we have right now? And you measure that against yours. If you have an issue, you can either have the centralized repository overwrite, you can raise a flag, you can do lots of different things. But it's important for you to know, I got a discrepancy here in my checkbook. So these all happen to the targets. So the targets are getting modified and telling you what modifications have happened. Now sometimes it's clean, it's an API, the same provisioning when you call also gives you that result saying it's successfully added, etc. Sometimes it's different systems. I've worked with one where you did the API revision and you read from a Snowflake database that was up to a day old to know if it actually worked or not. That's less than ideal. Okay, so reviews. We're going to talk through three types of reviews. There are a whole plethora of reviews, but there's three basic types. There's a user access review. And when I talk users, most of you are thinking humans with belly buttons. But I'm also talking other types of accounts. So as we go through, we're going to talk about individual accounts, shared accounts, which is still humans, service accounts, which is a non-human identity and account, and bot. Now some people think bot and service are the same, some think they're different. For this argument, we're just going to say we're going to deal with bots as well. But a user access review is usually periodic in nature, unless you've had a mover event. A mover event, you might trigger a specific one, but let's talk the periodic one for a second. On the periodic one, you're going to sit there and say, the Bob's manager, here's Bob's access. Does this look correct? Okay, that's great. Now, one interesting one is you'd sit there and say, well, Bob's manager may or may not know if Bob should have this access or not, or he might rubber stamp it, which is when they just say, okay. There are things you can do around this, and on all these, there's different tools, different techniques. One I've seen in the access review is what's called a honey entitlement. Some of you have heard of honey pots before, where you place a special box in your network that nobody should be going to. Somebody goes to it, you raise alarms because it's usually a bad guy. A honey entitlement is an entitlement that doesn't actually exist. So if Bob's manager gets a report that says Bob has entitlement X, Y, Z, and it doesn't exist, and the description might even be as blatant as, this is a honey entitlement, you should remove this. I've seen that in action where people just said, okay, and approved the entire thing. So you can do honey entitlements, you can keep track of how many things people revoke over time, you can keep track of how long it takes a manager to do a review, you can do lots of stuff. Usually a good metric for that is percentage of entitlements that are revoked on reviews. Now, the next one on that one is still the transfer review or mover review. Somebody had a mover event, switched places they work. What are the odds that they need all those entitlements? We might have cleared the privileged ones, but even the non-privileged ones. Their manager, the receiving manager, the person captured, that they're now going to work for, should be looking at them within a set amount of time. NIST says a company-defined amount of time, an acceptable amount of time, but they should basically be saying, should this person still have this access? Maybe, maybe not. But they should be putting their reputation on the line as the manager, saying that. Now, the second type of review is an owner access review. This is typically for what I call an IAM object. I call an IAM object because nobody I've talked to has a better name for it. Could be an account, could be an entitlement, could be an access role, could be an access profile, could be a lot of different things, but stuff that are managed by IAM. So IAM object. Okay. But let's say you're the entitlement owner for a privileged entitlement. System administration, domain admin for Active Directory. You should have a really small group of people that have that access. You should be guarding that access really closely. But you also should periodically be reviewing who has that access and go, how did they get on there? And get them off and figure out how they got on there. But the owner access review is a periodic review of an entitlement or a role or a role you have to check what access is granted and who's currently part of it. And if it's provisioned by an automated provisioned by an automated rule for the role, I know, all IT employee, is that still correct? And then finally, the metadata. So this could be folded in to some of the other ones or separate, depends on how you run your organization. But you have to have somebody who reviews what an entitlement description has. It says it's privileged. Is it still privileged? Or it says it's not privileged. Is it not privileged? Who owns it? Who's the delegate owners? Is these still accurate? Things like that. Okay, so we have the owner access reviews, the owner metadata reviews, and the user access reviews. So now I'm going to talk, I said I wasn't really going to talk types of tools. I'll make one exception because a lot of people get confused. Identity governance and administration, IGA, as it's often called. So the governance focuses on how you prove these things are being managed, and then the identity administration, you start getting into some of the access requests and approvals, etc. But basically, you'll notice I took out the identity store up top, the Workday, and the identity verification, but I left most of the rest of the stuff here in yellow, orange, and green. That covers a lot of what an IGA does, just so you know. Now, there are different vendors that make different IGAs. There are some that have light IGA, heavy IGA. It varies, but I thought I'd cover that because there is some confusion. Okay. So another part of your company or your security organization or usually IT covers IT logging. What should be logged? Where it should be logged? But there are a couple things that we're concerned about. First of all, anything that touches access management or identity management, you create a new account, you added an entitlement, you removed an entitlement. Any of those things the administrator does on the system or the system does should be recorded and logged somewhere other than where you're at, usually a centralized repository where you cannot modify the data. The administrator cannot modify the data Because that's how you survive an audit and such, and prove that you weren't hacked all the way through. But it's also important for you to say those things in your standards or your policies. You have to log these minimum types of things, and they have to follow these centralized IT logging plan, put them in a centralized location where they can be monitored. And then, how do you tell your program is working? First one is with metrics, KPIs, KRIs, et cetera, et cetera. You can basically say, these are happening this percentage of time, these many times, all that stuff. You have analytics where you can start mapping if something is normal, common. You start getting into the AI space. I know I said I wasn't going to touch on AI, but we heard AI a lot this weekend, today, and some of it was how do you secure AI, the other one's how do you make AI work for you. And how you make AI work for you is like in the access request and approval. Is Bob like his peers when he asks for this access? In reviews, is Bob like his peers when he has this access? And in roles, is Bob, all these people have this entitlement and are part of this organizational unit. Maybe that organizational unit should have a role that grants them this access, things like that. And then IAM reporting. All the reporting is in metrics that tells you if you're healthy, if you've got orphaned accounts, if you've got all this fun stuff. Okay. So access logging flows typically out of the targets. It can actually flow out of the IAM stuff as well, but if I drew arrows all going to the logging, it could be a lot of arrows. Then metrics, analytics, and reporting, typically out of the data and the access event logging. Okay. So now we're going to delve into a whole different area, going into authentication. So we've set up all this stuff to grant you some of the access that you need. Now we're going to actually use it. So single sign-on confuses some people. Because we used to do a lot of password synchronization. There are a lot of those people who still think that equals single sign-on. It doesn't. So what risk are we trying to solve with single sign-on? Well, we're trying to make the user experience a little better. That's true. But the security risk we're trying to address is where are my passwords being stored? And do I have my arms around that? And people go, well, that's the cafeteria menu system. Why does that matter? Because some of my users are going to reuse their AD passwords and accounts in the cafeteria menu system. And I guarantee you, the cafeteria menu system probably doesn't have good security. So when it's hacked, you're going to be able to use those same accounts and entitlements, or same accounts and passwords, to attack the rest of this. So single sign-on addresses this by not having you log on to the individual discrete applications. You log into what's known as an identity provider, get a token that you can then pass that token onto these applications, and they trust that identity provider. They've set up a trust with it, and they can validate that as a legitimate token, so the downstream application never has it. That's good. Multi-factor authentication. So we started with without passwords. If you go back and look at some of the earliest protocols, they didn't have such things as password. Then they added password, user account password. And usually the first ones had to do with billing, not security. They wanted the departments to pay when they used certain resources. But then they quickly modified it to security. But password is something you know. There's two other types of authenticators. Something you have, which like a physical token, a 502 token, your phone that might have a smart app on it, etc. Or something you are, facial biometrics, fingerprints, etc., etc. And MFA is basically saying, and a lot of the laws and regs specify when you have to use MFA. But it says you have to have at least two of those. PCI is very specific on this. If you have two passwords, that's two something you know, doesn't count. So you have to have at least two of these, and like a lot of your laws and regs say, most of them say you have to have it for privileged access. Most of them say you have to have it for remote access. Some of them say you have to have, PCI says you have to have it for all access into the card data environment now. there's a lot of laws, regs, and rules around MFA. Okay, so session management. That's the first thing. You're logging in, that's true, but you're keeping track of certain variables. One of it is how long has it been since you last had activity? Another one is how long you've been logged in, period. And there's laws and regs that talk about that too. If you've been inactive for more than 15 minutes, typically you have to be re-authenticated and locked out for that period of time. Now, a lot of them will allow you to do a locking screensaver as facilitating that. But other things like NIST. NIST is a government requirement for a lot of us in the civilian world. We use NIST as a recommendation. And NIST 863, which is your friend if you're in identity and access management, is very specific for different levels of authentication, how long your session timeouts can be. If you're in AAO1, which I won't go into because we're trying to stay high level today, but if you're in AAO1, the easiest step, you can keep a session open for 30 days. If you're AAL2, which is more restricted, you can keep a session open for 12 hours. Then you have to either re-authenticate or terminate the session. From there, we feed over to single sign-on federation. Easy way to remember this is single sign-on it's for my company. Federation, I'm either trusting or they're trusting my company to do it for them. That's why they're grouped together. That's a high-level nutshell. And then they both go to strong authentication. Strong authentication means we're going to authenticate at the level we need to. Usually that means MFA for privilege or remote access. It might be just simple username and password at other levels, etc. But the strength you need. Then we talk continuous risk-based authentication. That's just getting fancy. So what if we had other pieces of data about you, which we do, and we use them to make authentication decisions? So one way to look at this is we know what IP address you're coming from. Okay, maybe certain IPs are more trustworthy than others. Now you can't VPN, and we all know there's tricks to avoid it, but you're just raising the bar higher. With certain countries, if you're dealing with the federal government, if you're in the United States, there's certain countries you shouldn't do business with. Those are called OFAC countries. So maybe you restrict those. Maybe you sit there and say, is this a trusted workstation or untrusted? Do I have an MDM on mobile phone? Do I have any diagnostic software on the workstation? Do I know that's a trusted workstation? Are you coming in with impossible travel? You logged in from Paris and 30 minutes later you logged in from LA. That's weird. All these things can be factored into authentication, and then you can make one of three basic decisions. Do you have enough authentication already? Do I need to step up your authentication, which is I let you in with a little less, and now I want you to validate at a higher level? Or no, you can't come in. Just no. Okay, so authenticator management. This is a mouthful here, but when you think about passwords, tokens, fingerprints, etc., you're covering this whole gamut. Generation, you're creating the password. Distribution, you're sending somebody a physical token. Registration and binding, you're saying this is my fingerprint, or this is my physical token. Storage, where are you keeping these things? You know, if you have a password and you're not using it regularly, put it in a vault, things like that. Expiration. Do you expire your account? We had a great topic earlier today on non-human identities and how quickly they should be rotated and how often they really are rotated. Renewal. Your password's expiring, it hasn't expired yet. You want to renew it before it expires. That usually is less sensitive. Rotation. Again, when a service account might have multiple passwords and be able to rotate them through. Reset and recovery, usually two sides of the same coin. Usually reset is a little bit less secure. Recovery, you've lost enough things that you need to be validated at a deeper level. Revocation, I don't like that. That token, I think John has, or his password, yeah, I don't trust that anymore. I'm just gonna revoke that. And then disposal is when you want to physically destroy something or cryptographically destroy something, etc. But we can spend all day on any of these topics. But I told you we'd be back to identity verification. We left orange, but we're back to orange again. That's usually around authentication. So you just started at the company. Bob just started at the company. I don't know Bob, especially if Bob's not in my office. If he's working from home or as a contractor out of the contract center, how do I prove Bob is Bob before I let him register his password and his physical token? Well, identity verification used to be called identity proofing, but it's kind of metamorphosed lately. There's a whole bunch of companies that have sprung up that are doing this now. They're checking things like driver's license, passports, liveness checks. They're doing all kinds of fun stuff to prove Bob is Bob before you A, let him in and set his original, or if you lose enough things, because MFA, I told you, MFA is you have two of those three things minimum. So let's say you have a passport and you have a phone, and you lose your password. You still have your phone, you still have your smart token, but if you change your password with just that, is that MFA? No. But I let you change it and then force you back to MFA. But if you're the bad guy and you have possession of the phone, I forgot my password.
Too easy.
Too easy, too easy. So if you forget or lose enough things that you can't authenticate in at a certain level and have to recover some of those, force them down identity verification. Okay, so authenticator management, and then we just draw a layer up to identity verification. And we're running out of time, so I'm going to go quick. When you're talking authentication, or authorization, sorry, it's access to stuff. You're allowed to get into stuff. Admin time, also known as static authorization, is when ahead of time I've given you permission to be Windows domain administrator, things like that. Access policy management can mean a lot of different things. In this case, we're going to talk roles real quick. And roles access is going to provision the stuff. It's still admin time access, but it's based off of identity, attributes, etc. And then finally, there's runtime authorization, which is more real time, or also known as ABAC, or sometimes called PBAC. Attribute-based authentication control and policy-based authentication control. So that's when you're in real time going, what's Jonathan have access to? Let me check right now. So it's not standing. And we'll draw those lines real quick. So it all connects like this. And the only thing we're missing right now is what I said, privileged access management, which is built on top of everything else. So secrets management, vaulting, is just authenticator management, but it's typically for service accounts, things like that, where you have to store them safely away, not display them directly in code. We talked about that in the non-human talk earlier today, given by our friend in the front row. The vaulting of the secrets and secured location, that's usually around service accounts, bot accounts, sometimes shared accounts, etc. And then privileged session management. We talk session management, where you keep track of certain attributes. Privileged session management is usually talking about you validating this Bob as he comes in, using his authenticators with MFA, and then you're tracking everything Bob does that's privileged. And then finally, just-in-time access. That's saying we don't leave him with domain administrator. We just give him that when he needs it. But there's two major types of just-in-time. There's, I'm going to authorize you on your request every single time you ask for it. Most people don't do, but that is one way you could do it. And that's true just-in-time. The other way, like AWS does, is you're pre-approved to step up that authentication, which I consider still to be standing entitlements of a different type and still need to go through access reviews. So we filled in the blank spots in the map, and we're at questions. So I told you we were going to drain that slide.
How many years have you been working with IAM?
5.
5 years. What's the most interesting thing about it?
Well, IAM is one of those areas where from the outside it looks so simple. You just have accounts, you have entitlements, you have passwords, why is it so hard, why are you taking so
Yeah, it's a majority of people, yeah.
yeah, and then when you get out to the coverage and start looking at it, that rabbit hole goes deep. So it's fascinating because everyone wants to oversimplify things, but you can't. Especially when you have all this legacy technology. I know a greenfield company can walk right in and set things up the right way and do it easily. But large corporate environments that have mainframes and Unix boxes and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This just goes so deep and you have to understand how it all interconnects, and I find that stuff fascinating. Any other questions? Yes?
Are there any technologies on the periphery that will radically change this map in the next 5 years, perhaps?
I don't think, when I'm talking capabilities, I'm rarely surprised. When I'm talking technologies, I'm often surprised, and often it's usually mine. But somebody comes to me and say, I'm cloud, cloud, this doesn't apply to me. Or I'm, insert technology here, I'm containers, this doesn't apply to me. Well, it kind of does. I mean, if you think about what we were talking about with machine identities earlier, you're talking about secrets management, you're talking about the same stuff. Yes, sir.
Pete, in your experience with manager access review, I mean, obviously you've done them, you've seen them.
Yeah.
Everything that you showed here, there's a lot of missing pieces that are not part of the manager access review. What are your thoughts in incorporating anything, or do you feel happy with the way they are in your?
Oh, I'm never happy. First place is this application onboarding. If you don't have the application in the system, then the reporting, the reviews don't occur. So that's the first thing, you gotta force everything in there that you can get in there. Second thing is you have to get rid of the rubber stamping. I don't care if you use honey entitlements, I don't care if you start naming and shaming like we heard in that last talk. I don't care how we do it, but we prove that you're not doing your job. And if you're a manager, that's your job. The other thing is zero basing. I talked about if you shift to departments or something. What if you zero base everybody? It'd be annoying, but it would reduce a lot of the standing access that just keeps going from job to job to job.
Yeah,
collect
don't clear them
access.
out. Before everybody goes, they informed me that the lockpick raffle is now available in the UC Center. So just go over there, get your raffle, and then they'll put you in.
Cool. And if anybody wants to hit me up after this, happy to discuss any and all of this stuff, but thank you very much.